A very warm welcome and thank you for joining. You're looking at the title page here on the right of Poems written by Will Shakespeare Gent, published by John Benson in 1640. And opposite on the left-hand side you can see an engraving which is by William Marshall, and underneath that caption verses which describe the engraving. And it's the verses and the engraving that I want to talk about today. Now, many of you, or the sharp-eyed among you, will be saying, hang on, isn't something dodgy going on here? Haven't you previously already shown us this title page and there was something completely different to the left of it? And yes, you're right. If you turn 4 pages on, you will recognize this, the same title page on the right, but this time a poem by John Warren, which is called Of Mr. William Shakespeare. Why is exactly the same title page used twice, with 2 different poems on the left each time? The only answer I can think of is because the title page is trying to alert you to the fact that there is a connection between this poem by John Warren and this poem, which is not said to be by anyone. I've called this presentation William Marshall New, really for want of the proper name of whoever it was who wrote this verse. William Marshall, of course, made the engraving, and I'm pretty sure that it wasn't William Marshall who wrote this poem. In fact, if I were to put money on it, though I can't prove it, I would say it was John Warren, that they were both written by the same person because they are connected. One of the ways they're connected, those of you who saw the presentation John Warren New will remember that we counted the syllables in each of the lines and discovered that there were 10 syllables in every single line except for one, and that was this line right here, which was signalled by the great gap to its left. "'Tis love that thus to thee is shown" is only 8 syllables. So the learned reader is being asked to find 2 missing syllables, and the clues within the poem tell us that those missing syllables have to have something to do with veer. So either Oxford or our veer would fit. "'Tis our veer's love that thus to thee is shown, the labour's his, the glory still thine own." So the poet is fitting in the missing name and telling you that one person actually wrote the poems, did the labour, and another person is taking the glory for it. Now, if you want the details of that, as I say, do look at the presentation called John Warren New. But what I want to show now is how exactly the same technique is used just 4 pages earlier with this poem here. Looking at the picture first, there's one thing at least that's very odd about it, and that is this bright light that appears to be behind his head. I've never unable to find anything like it actually. I'd be interested if anyone else can. A portrait from this period with a bright light directly behind the head. Of course, the reason why the light is behind the head is surely to show that whatever is in front or is obscuring the light is but a shadow. The poem starts, "This shadow," describing it as a shadow. If you go to the Oxford English Dictionary and look up shadow, of course, it's a tract of partial darkness produced by a body intercepting the direct rays of the sun. That's one definition of it. Also a definition slightly more obsolete in the Oxford English Dictionary describes a shadow as an unreal appearance, a delusive semblance or image. So perhaps we are being deluded here, and that's why we've got a picture of a shadow. But it's interesting going back in history how William Shakespeare is defined as a shadow. William Harvey defined him as a shadow in 1594. And only 2 years later, in 1596, Sir John Davis talks of Shakespeare as the shadow who sings of a shadow under a shadow. Now, of course, we all know why he's being called a shadow, and it's all to do with the fact that we are dealing with a concealed poet who is using a pseudonym, and this has been known for a very long time. In fact, if we go into the 1740s, and we see this copy of the bust in Westminster Abbey, which belongs to the cousin of the man who actually did it, Lord Pembroke. The man who originally founded this whole arrangement and put it in Westminster Abbey was Lord Burlington, and his cousin was Lord Pembroke, the 9th Earl of Pembroke. Here you can see the statue pointing at the word shadow. It's not a terribly good image, shadow player. That's not a very good image either, but maybe you can make it out a bit clearer. You can see that his finger is pointing at shadow and player. So again, this connection of William Shakespeare with shadows is all to do with pseudonymous writing. Now, what I would like to do is look first then at the picture, and then we'll come to the lines underneath it. So the first and most obvious thing about this picture, I think everyone will agree, is that it is a copy of the very famous picture, which was published 17 years earlier in 1623 by Martin Droeshout in the first folio of Shakespeare. You can see straight away, looking at the rather gross hairy chin and the hairs spouting out of his lower lip, etc., etc. In fact, were I to enlarge and turn the Marshal round, then it becomes even more obvious that there's no question. I've never heard anyone try to pretend that the Marshal isn't copied from the Droeshout, even down to those sun rays on his collar, the 2 on the left and the 4 on the right, the de Vere, the little clue about de Vere that we talked about in another presentation. So this is a copy of the Droeshout, but the question then is, if Marshal was copying the Droeshout, why didn't he copy it properly? Why did he put that weird light directly behind his head? That's not on the Droeshout. And why did he not copy his jacket? And why did he invert it so that he's looking the other way, etc., etc.? What is actually going on? If I were to produce for you a very, very typical picture of another poet and playwright from exactly the same time, this was also published in 1640, this is Nathaniel Richards. Straight away you can see some very obvious differences. First of all, Richards has his coat of arms at the top, and there is no coat of arms on the Shakespeare picture. This, by the way, is a massive problem always for Stratfordianists. They cannot explain why the coat of arms are not on pictures like this, as it jolly well should be. And they appeal to silly ideas like, oh, the engraver simply forgot, or they didn't think it was necessary. Well, that's not getting properly into the minds of engravers and books and bibliophiles at the time. It's simply finding an extremely lame excuse. If this were Stratford Shakespeare, he should have his coat of arms above his head, and there's no question about that. He should also have on his head a crown of bays to show that he's a great poet, and not simply a bald head. He shouldn't be clutching bays as though he's stolen them in his left hand beneath. Here we have Nathaniel Richards, of course, holding a book, which refers to the fact, quite obviously, that he is a writer and a man of letters. No such thing can you see on the Marshal engraving of Shakespeare. And finally, at the bottom here, you have the attestation of the engraver, saying in Latin that this is the true likeness, the likeness to the life of Nathaniel Richards. And there's nothing on the Shakespeare portrait that says this is truly the likeness of William Shakespeare. All those things are obvious things, but they're missing. And anyone with a nous of curiosity would be saying, why on earth are these things missing from the Shakespeare? Not just blithely carrying on and say Shakespeare of Stratford wrote all these things and arguing the hind leg of a donkey with people who are actually concentrating. I've brought up now a picture that was also published for the first time in the same year, and this is Ben Jonson. And you can see straight away that he's got books, 4 books down in the corner there, and there's an obvious difference again with the Shakespeare. Here you have the Latin saying the true likeness, vera effigies, of the most learned poet, English poet, Ben Jonson. So once again, the attestation is there from the engraver, who in this case was Robert Vaughan, telling you, attesting to the fact that this picture is of Ben Jonson, and he was indeed a poet. Very clearly missing on the Shakespeare. But I bring this up because one extremely good, learned Oxfordian scholar, Catherine Children, in her excellent book called Shakespeare Suppressed, makes passing reference to this picture, saying that she believes that the Shakespeare by Marshall on the left was actually copied the Ben Jonson. She doesn't go into much detail, and I would like to go into a bit more detail and try and support her argument. First of all, you'll notice that he's wearing this mantle over his shoulder, Ben Jonson, I've outlined the collar shape of it. In fact, I can do the same on the other side to the Shakespeare. So you can see it's exactly the same type of mantle that seems to be covering one of the shoulders. In the case of Shakespeare, it's covering the whole of his right arm, as though he doesn't have a right arm. This imitates what happened in the Droeshout portrait of 1623, where very clever tailor happened to notice that the stitching on his so-called right arm was in fact the stitching on the back of his left arm. So he too has no right arm. He's a left-hander, which means there's something a little bit fraudulent about him. If you look at Johnson's bare hand here, he's holding a pair of gloves. Anyone watching this who understands the significance of holding gloves, I'd be very grateful if they would put it in the comments box. I haven't managed to find it, but it is a very old and established thing. I found portraits of Henry VIII, of Queen Elizabeth, and going right through to the 19th century actually, of people holding gloves. So there's obviously some significance to it. I suspect there's also significance in the fact that in this particular picture you can see of the two gloves that 6 fingers are showing. I bet that means something. Again, if one of the viewers can interpret that for me, I'd be very grateful. But anyway, the bare hand is holding gloves, and you can see by contrast Shakespeare's got his gloved hand on, and he's clasping the laurels or the bays that rightfully should be upon his head as a crown of bays, just as you see them here, the crown of bays on Ben Jonson's head. Great contrast with the completely bald head of William Shakespeare. And you can see what William Marshall has done. He's taken the exact same forehead from the Droeshout with a very bright light in the mirror in the middle. And that will remind you, those of you who have seen the presentation that I've done on that what we're looking at here is actually Apollo, the patron of all poets, Apollo and the god of the sun, Phoebus, shining through the mask of a player. The figure here holding the bays has stolen the bays from the head of Apollo. Now remember that Edward de Vere was called by at least 15 of his contemporaries, or likened by 15 of his contemporaries, to Apollo. And what we seem to be getting here is the body, if you like, of Ben Jonson holding the stolen bays that rightfully belong to Apollo. So we're in a very interesting situation here. We seem to have an engraving of Shakespeare which is made up as a hybrid of the Droeshout head of Shakespeare with the body of Ben Jonson underneath. This goes back to the numerous complaints that seem to be going on at the time of Ben Jonson that he had raped the fame of Shakespeare, that his prefatory lines in the first folio, which had, albeit very opaquely, shifted the identity of Shakespeare away from Edward de Vere and onto William Shakespeare of Stratford. So it seems to be a complaint about that. Now we're going to have a look at the lines which support this interpretation. This shadow is renowned Shakespeare's, soul of the age, the applause, delight, the wonder of the stage. Nature herself was proud of his designs, and joyed to wear the dressing of his lines. The learned will confess his works are such as neither man nor muse can praise too much. For ever live thy fame the world to tell, thy like no age shall ever parallel. Well, we can all read that in the shallow way that it's been read for 400 years, if we wish, and take it to mean that Shakespeare's a jolly good chap and there's no one to equal him. But we're learning fast and furious that poems of this period need to be read in depth, and especially poems that deal with William Shakespeare. They're always hiding things, they're always making little jokes and asides and concealing the truth about him. So let's do precisely that. Let's look a bit deeper into it. Now remember, I said that this poem is connected to the poem 4 pages later by John Warren, and it plays exactly the same trick as Warren played. He allows all of the lines to have 10 syllables per line except one. And when we find out what that line is and work out what the problem is, we learn a little bit more about Shakespeare and Shakespeare's identity. So in Warren, there were 2 syllables missing from the line, "'Tis love that thus to thee is shown." And here you will see that all of the lines have 10 syllables except for one, which is the first. He hasn't dropped any syllables from this line. In fact, he's done the opposite. He has added 2. This line has 12 syllables, where all the rest have 10. This shadow is renowned Shakespeare's, soul of th' age. So 2 syllables too many. And we need, therefore, to rectify this and to get rid of those extra 2 syllables in such a way that the line continues to rhyme with the line beneath it, that it continues to make sense, etc., etc. So is there any clue as to which 2 syllables should not be there? Well, of course there is. There's one 2-syllable word that has a great question mark after it. Shakespeare's, rather suggesting that it is those 2 syllables that need to be removed. So let's place them to the side as though they are some sort of parenthetical margent. This shadow, Shakespeare's, as the question is being asked. This shadow is renowned soul of the age. Here we're using a slightly archaic form of renowned, as I might say, my wife is renowned virtuous, or this knight was renowned worthy the world over. Renowned means praised as or celebrated as, so by repute, but particularly in terms of praise. So this shadow is renowned soul of the age, the applause, delight, the wonder of the stage. Notice how those question marks seem to have been put in. Not only was there one on Shakespeare's, but there's one on applause, there's one on delight. Now, many of you will recognize these words as coming from the first folio of Shakespeare, 17 years earlier, in the words of Ben Jonson. Soul of the age, the applause, delight, the wonder of our stage. And there you can see that Jonson has put exclamation marks, or what he, in his book on grammar and punctuation, calls marks of admiration. Soul of the age, the applause, delight, the wonder of the stage, exclamation marks. And whoever seems to be copying him or taking the piss out of him above has changed some of those exclamation marks for question marks. Again, we are questioning the very identity of Shakespeare and the connection of Shakespeare to the picture above these lines. Nature herself was proud of his designs and joyed to wear the dressing of his lines. The learned will confess his works are such as neither man nor muse can praise too much. Well, who are these learned who will confess that his works are such? Well, there's only one person who's being referred to here, and it is, of course, Ben Jonson. At the very beginning of the same poem in the first folio, he writes, while I confess thy writings to be such as neither man nor muse can praise too much. So the poem above from 1640 is clearly and unambiguously alluding to Ben Jonson as the learned who confess such a thing. You'll notice also at the beginning of Jonson's poem, to draw no envy, Shakespeare, which he writes in parentheses on thy name. And so the poem above seems to be picking up on this very same idea of shoving Shakespeare's name into parentheses, because of course the name is only a pseudonym. And here we've seen how it should be taken out of the line and shoved to one side. Shakespeare's question mark as a sort of parenthetical margent note. Well, of course, as everybody knows, the bite or the salt, the sting, if you like, the punch of an epigram or even a sonnet of poems of this day come in the last couplet. So we need to look very carefully to see what this is saying. The Stratfordians will say he's addressing Shakespeare and simply saying that you're absolutely brilliant and no age will ever parallel you. Indeed, the Oxfordian might pick up on the 2 iterations of the word ever to eke out the interpretation, for evere live thy fame, the world to tell thy like, no age shall evere parallel. Some Oxfordians won't like the smell of that because the last line, thy like, addressing him, and then shall evere parallel. Perhaps it'd be better just to allow the second ever to remain as ever. But either way, both the Stratfordian and the Oxfordian are here falling into the same trap and making the same error. because if you look at this poem carefully, the last couplet cannot be addressed to the author of Shakespeare's plays, and there are a number of reasons for this. For a start, we have in the lines above obvious evidence that he is being addressed in the third person. We talk of his designs, of his lines, and of his works. Whereas in the last couplet, we've suddenly got thy fame and thy like. So the address has been turned away from the poet, if you like, to some other party who is now being addressed in the second person, thy fame and thy like. Now we need to look for clues to work out who is being addressed here. Another reason I would say briefly why it cannot be the author William Shakespeare, whoever he was, because we have on the last line here, no age shall ever parallel thy like. Well, we saw in the very first line that he is renowned soul of the age. So it seems to be contradicting itself if they were both the same person, to suddenly say that of the soul of the age, that no age will ever parallel his like. So we need to look a bit more carefully. I think the word like is a clue here. Look it up in the Oxford English Dictionary, and one set of meanings, of course, is form, shape or guise, likeness, an obsolete meaning, it has to be said, but nonetheless it was used in that way. Form, shape or guise, or even likeness. So that is pointing us, I think, to only one addressee, and that is, of course, the shadow, the picture that is above is suddenly being addressed. Well, does it make sense now if you start saying, forever live thy fame? Well, even though we know that fame can mean infamy, it doesn't have to mean fame in a sense of praise, but why forever live thy fame? Why wish it longevity? This picture, which is this weird hybrid composite of Ben Jonson and the Droeshout portrait of Shakespeare. No, again, I would suggest that we scrutinize this even more carefully. For, let's look up that carefully. It can also mean instead of or in place of. I could say, for a spoon, use this fork. Of course, Shakespeare says, for Achilles' image stood his spear. In other words, instead of the image of Achilles, all you could see was his spear. That's a line from Lucrece, and it's well worth looking at because he's, of course, talking about the shaking spear of Achilles and is referring very obliquely to his own pseudonym Shakespeare. Okay, so if we take for to mean instead of or in place of, and then I think we can maintain the e vir ever in the first instance. So I could paraphrase those last two lines, something like this: in place of e vir, live thy fame, i.e. you rubbishy shadow, for all to know that thy guise no age shall ever parallel. In other words, the last two lines are not praising Shakespeare, they are being rude about the Ben Jonson Droeshout composite picture above, and saying that that then is how Shakespeare will be remembered in place of, instead of e vir. So a critical, rather vicious last two lines, as one might expect, making great fun and great mockery of what's going on, but still one presumes then in 1640, under this pall of not being able to tell the truth, still having to keep the truth somehow shrouded. And there are lots of reasons for this. I've gone into them in other presentations, why so many years were passing in which people who knew that Shakespeare was a pseudonym used by the Earl of Oxford were still having to maintain this bizarre secrecy. I hope it's made sense. I hope you've enjoyed it. I hope if you have enjoyed it and you're not a subscriber, you'll subscribe to these presentations and press the bell button, so each time something new comes, you will be forewarned. Thank you very much for watching.